Okay, so to bring it home, we wanted to try to apply everything you've learned now to various groups that have difficulty navigating the process. Some of these groups traditionally have had problems. Some see new problems emerging with the voter photo ID law. First off, and we've talked about this now with absentee voting, is our elderly and voters with disabilities. Traditionally, these folks are voting through absentee ballot. Because they just don't get around as well as they used to. They're perhaps in some sort of care facility. Most times they're voting by absentee ballot, although we do see situations, as Katie described with the special voting deputies, where instead of having something go through the mail, they're actually having an election official come in person to them. It's important to know for our elderly and people with disabilities that there are accommodations available to them. And specifically, I'm looking at the list on page 48, and this is not an exhaustive list, but there are some accommodations that are available that you may not know about. For example, curbside voting. It's entirely possible that if you can get down to your polling place in a vehicle, but for whatever reason you can't get inside the building, you can ask for your ballot to be delivered to you out at your vehicle. Obviously, someone has to go inside the polling place to let the poll workers know that you're out there, or you could perhaps call ahead and try and schedule the time that you're going to be appearing curbside. But this option is available. 2 poll workers will come out of the polling place and they will deliver your ballot to you outside. In this particular case, you would be exempt from signing the poll list as well, because for security reasons, we're not going to take the poll list outside. Also, as I mentioned with signing the poll list, if for whatever reason you can't sign the poll list, you've got a physical impairment or disability that prevents you from being able to sign, simply indicate that. Your poll worker can write exempt by order of the election inspectors due to that disability. Also, every polling place does have accessible voting equipment. The federal government and your local municipalities have shelled out quite a bit of money to have these accessible pieces of equipment so that every person, even if they have some sort of disability, can vote privately and independently. You don't have to have someone come with you and help you fill out your ballot. That's certainly an option if you want. You can have an assistant come with you to the polling place, but we have this equipment in the polling place, so that shouldn't be necessary. That you can always choose to vote privately and independently. When it comes to bringing an assistant with you, like I said, that is an option. That person does not need to be a qualified voter. It can be a minor child. That's perfectly fine. The only restrictions is that it cannot be your employer or an agent of your labor union. Those are the 2 exceptions we have. Assistance can also include reading the ballot, and we had the question before about illiteracy, and that's a disability that is covered. People can get assistance reading their ballot. That's a perfectly valid reason to get assistance. And any other reasonable accommodation is something that you can request from your municipal clerk. That's because of the Americans with Disabilities Act that we have this option to provide reasonable accommodation when requested. But the key is that it's requested. If you have a particular impairment or disability, you need to let your municipal clerk know so that we can try to work with that person to accommodate whatever their need is. I've been in this business now for about 5 years, and I have yet to find a poll worker or a municipal clerk who wasn't willing to go out of their way to try to find a way to get a ballot to an individual who had a particular need. So all that's required is that you identify that need to the poll worker or to your municipal clerk. If you provide an indication of your disability or your need for a particular accommodation on your voter registration, it's also important to know that's confidential. No one else sees that except for the municipal clerk, so that they can provide the assistance requested. So no one can make a public records request, for example, and find out any particular ailment or disability you may have that makes it necessary for you to have some sort of accommodation. We also have people who are voluntarily and involuntarily committed in mental health institutions. Our first question with these individuals is their eligibility. If you're in a mental health facility, odds are you have a guardian appointed for you, even if it's only on a temporary basis. If you have gone through guardianship, one of the questions a judge will ask and determine is whether or not you still have the competency required to exercise your right to vote. But it's very important that people understand that just because you have a guardian doesn't make you incompetent. A voter can be incompetent to make their medical decisions or financial decisions or other decisions, but the right to vote is sacred, and the courts don't take that away lightly. So it's incumbent on the guardian to identify whether or not their ward is eligible to vote by looking at that guardianship order. The state also receives that information, so if somebody who was registered to vote is declared incompetent to vote through the courts, we get a notification that person's voter registration will be revoked and removed. But really, it's a private process. These orders are confidential for the most part. So it's only in those orders, though, that you're going to find out who is incompetent to vote. And again, it only goes through the court process. This is not something that a family member can say, mom or dad, they're suffering from whatever condition and they just shouldn't be allowed to vote anymore. They don't get to make that call. Even the doctor doesn't make that call. Both of those opinions, the doctor and the family member, are very valuable at the hearing where a judge may decide this, but only a judge gets to make that determination that somebody is incompetent to vote. The second question we have with individuals in these facilities is their address for voting purposes. And we've just set a policy based on how they are at the facility. If they're voluntarily at a facility, they can use that facility's address for voting purposes. They can also choose to use whatever their address is in the community if they're going back there, if they have that intent to return to that address. If they're involuntarily committed, then they can't use the facility. They have to use whatever address they had in the community before they came to the facility. And that's just laid out by statute. That's how it's described for us. Again, because they're confined to some sort of facility, be it voluntary or involuntarily, these individuals are going to be voting through absentee ballot. So all the rules and restrictions that we talked about before about absentee voting do apply. The one thing I will note, though, is that the indefinitely confined status is due to age, illness, or disability, and that includes mental illness as well. And again, under ADA, reasonable accommodations are available for these individuals. The next group that we see, and probably the group that has the most difficulty with voter registration and voting, is the homeless. They really are the square peg trying to fit into the round hole of elections. Our system is designed, it's built from the ground up with the idea that every person has a structure, some sort of physical structure that they can declare as their residence. And the system is really not built and the laws are not written with the idea of someone not having that physical structure that they can call home. So the primary question is usually, what is the address? What is the address this person is going to vote from? And as we talked about before with proof of residence, there are options for them to provide a proof of residence, be it an affidavit from a service group that works with the homeless, be it a shelter or other social service agency, or it can be other documents. These other documents need to identify a particular address, though, and so if you're identifying a park bench or a particular parking lot, there's not a lot of the traditional documents under proof of residence that would allow someone to use those sorts of addresses, and that's why we've provided that social service agency affidavit. That's their option. That's where they can go. Now, registration and proof of residence is one of the hard battles for these individuals as well, because what I was talking about with the lack of forms of proof of residence that can count for them. So with homeless voters, we really do encourage that if you're working with the homeless or you know someone's homeless, you encourage them to register early. If they register in the clerk's office before that 20-day cutoff point, they can register without providing proof of residence. They'll still need to provide photo ID, however, and that is the new obstacle we have for our homeless voters, is that even if you're homeless, even if you get an affidavit from a social service agency identifying a particular residence location, you still have to get some sort of photo ID. There's no exception in the law for our homeless. Now, the DMV has told us, and they have been working with various groups that work with the homeless to provide IDs to these individuals. They can provide a photo ID to a post office box, for example. Now, that photo ID, because it's got a post office box, is not going to work for proof of residence. They'll still need that affidavit from a social service agency, but their proof of identification that identification card from DMV could have a PO box, it could have an address of a shelter or other address that normally wouldn't be allowable. And again, the DMV tends to work with these individuals on a more of a one-to-one basis. So they may need to talk to the manager at the DMV service center, because the people at the front desk of the facility at the DMV service center may not be able to work with these individuals as much as someone at the management level who has more discretion in what documents are allowable. With our felons and incarcerated voters, we have first off the question of eligibility. If you've been convicted of a felony in Wisconsin or any other state, your voting rights are taken away for the duration of your sentence. And your sentence includes any term you serve in prison, as well as any term you're serving out in the community. It's very common now that felons are going to serve part of their sentence in jail, but then the other part of their sentence will be on supervised release, where they are reporting to a probation or parole agent, somebody from corrections. They're out in the community, but they're not done with their sentence yet. The term you may hear is off paper. When someone completes the terms of their sentence successfully and they're a full member of society again, they call it off paper. Once they're off paper, then they're eligible to vote again. And there's no special document they need to provide, there's no special process that they go through that restores their eligibility to vote. They simply get it upon completing their sentence successfully. The key point they need to remember, though, is that they will need to re-register. If they were registered to vote before they went into prison, their voter registration doesn't automatically come back after their sentence is completed. They do need to go back to the clerk's office or through some other method and register to vote. With people who are in jails on misdemeanor charges, they have not had their right to vote taken away. That's only for felons. So if they're in jail on a misdemeanor, they're still able to vote, but now the question is, what's the address? And again, like our people who are in mental institutions, if they're there involuntarily, so they don't get to use the address of the facility. They have to use the address where they came from in the community. And again, that's with that intent to return to that address or that municipality. Lastly, though, much like our homeless, these individuals do not have any sort of special exceptions. Indefinitely confined status does not apply to being in jail. They are not there because of an illness, unless they're not guilty by reason of insanity, perhaps, but they're not there due to a physical disability, illness, or infirmity. So they are required to go through the standard absentee voting process, and that includes providing a photo ID. Now, obviously, you're in jail. They're not going to let you out to go down to DMV Service Center and get an ID for you. So this is one of those situations that either a community organization or a friend or a family member may have to find an ID for them and bring it to them at the jail so that they can provide that copy because they're not going to be let out. One thing I will note, though, is that for felons that are being reintegrated into the community, Department of Corrections does have a program where they take these individuals down to DMV offices and get them a state identification card as part of the reintegration process into society. Voters changing their name are impacted by this law because of the fact that we've identified that there's now a window where someone could change their name, but they haven't received documentation yet that proves that new name. So our rule with the Government Accountability Board and what we're telling our election officials across the state is that a name change is not effective until a person receives updated documentation, be it a new state identification card, driver's license, or other document that could serve as their proof of identification. That's when we'll consider it to be an effective name change for voting purposes. Now, it's important to know, if you do get married, you change your name, you are going to be required to re-register once you've got that new ID. Because again, your name change is not effective until you've received that new ID. But once you receive it, know that you do have to re-register either on election day at the polling place, in the clerk's office, through the mail. One of those methods, we do need your updated information. And the question we'll get now with the married name change often is, does my name conform? People hyphenate their names now when they get married. And a hyphenated name, as long as the name includes all of the original parts of your name, so for example, if you're Jane Smith, and now you're Jane Smith -Jones, if your ID says Jane Smith, that's a conforming name. The entire old name is there. We can allow that that name does conform. That doesn't mean that we don't want that person to re-register once they receive a new identification card, but if they presented an identification card that had the old name, they could use that. That would be an example of a conforming name. Lastly, confidential voters have seen a change under photo ID. Documents required are the same as they've always been: protective orders, affidavits from law enforcement. They can also use signed statements from shelters or other agencies that are providing services to people that are victims of domestic abuse or sexual assault or stalking. They can provide those documents. The key, though, is that to apply to be a confidential voter, you do have to apply in person at your clerk's office, and you need to have that documentation with you. I would always encourage anyone who is a victim, who is in this situation, talk to someone at the district attorney's office if they have a victim witness services coordinator. They may be able to help them navigate the process, or talk to your local municipal clerk. They should be aware of the process as well and can help identify what that person needs to bring with them. The changes that they'll see is that on election day, they're going to be providing a confidential voter ID card that is specially issued by the municipal clerk, and they'll do that instead of providing a traditional photo ID. However, they are still required to sign the poll book, because the confidential voter ID card still has their name, it just doesn't have their address. And the part that they're signing is also a confidential portion of the poll book, so no one else can see that except for election officials, and the address will never appear on the same document. The address will only ever appear in clerk records, which again are confidential. So in summary, our main takeaway points we want you to remember for showing up tonight: photo identification is required at the polling place, so come prepared. There is no such thing as a separate voter ID. Don't take your friends or neighbors or family members down to DMV trying to find that special voter ID. If they've got one of the forms of ID that Katie described before, that's all they need. There's no need to go anywhere else. Election day, 3 points to remember: state, show, and sign. State your name and address, show your ID, sign your name to the poll book. It's that simple, those 3 steps. And then lastly, there are some exceptions, in particular with absentee voting. Those voters that apply as indefinitely confined electors, those in nursing homes or other care facilities have options. So please don't feel that you have to take your friend or family member who is in one of these care facilities or suffers from some sort of illness or impairment that prevents them from getting around. They shouldn't have to stand in line down at the DMV Service Center. The legislature provided these options to us in the law so that these individuals can provide some sort of substitute documentation. They can have their witness verify their proof of identification so that they don't have to go through that process. With that, all of the information we've presented tonight is available on our website. We've provided our contact information on pretty much every page that's on our packet. Feel free to give us a call. Again, I'm David, this is Katie. We're both available to answer your questions. We're usually pretty good in turning around those questions. I'm thinking I can usually do about 24-hour turnaround. I think Katie's probably in that range as well. We're happy to hear from you and take any questions you may have. Last thing we wanted to mention is that if you are aware of other organizations or groups that you're a member of that you think would benefit from hearing our presentation, please do encourage them to fill out a request form on our website so that they can schedule one of these presentations. Again, we'll likely be doing these all through 2012. Thank you. Please fill out your evaluation form. Your feedback does help us. We've only been doing this now for about a month and a half, so this is a relatively new presentation. As the law changes, we update the presentation, we update the materials, but any feedback you have is very helpful as well. And with that, we'll open it up to a final segment for discussion and questions. Any questions? I reserve the right to drag Katie up here to answer them too.
I'll come stand by you, David. The microphone's behind you, Roger. Got it.
Anyway, my question is on, you're talking about accessible voting machines. I belong to the National Federation of the Blind, and that was a big critical thing for us. The last 3 elections, 2 times the machines didn't work, and it made me feel frustrated as heck that we spent this kind of money. You go in there and you find out the design doesn't work, they don't know anything about it. Or they call and say, well, the guy couldn't get out here to look at it. When I called the I think it was the county clerk or somebody called officials, it might have been the state, they go, well, those machines are junk. I said, well, if they're junk, why don't you hold the manufacturer's feet to the fire and make them replace it or get what works? Because after 50-some years of not being able to vote privately, like all of you rest have had the opportunity to, it's a pleasure when you go in there and these machines, when they do work, they work sweet. But when they don't work, I don't have to resort to having a child, having somebody read me it. Everybody hears my votes, and I don't get that private ballot again. So I don't know what recourse we have. So far, those 2 times it happened, I had to have my wife do it, which I trust her, she'll fill it out right. That stuff. But it just irritates me that we spend this money, we get the right bounty to vote secretly, and when they don't work, there's really no recourse. You know, if you have any pull on that, but it'd be nice if they did something about it.
Well, thank you for reporting that to us. We can certainly look into it. All municipal clerks are required to test their voting equipment in the 10 days before an election, so...
That's what they told me, and then they said, well, after that, we don't care. You know, we'll work then, that's fine. I said, yeah, but how about the day out?
Okay. Well, we can certainly look into that, and if you want, we can talk after the presentation if you want to identify your municipality, and maybe I can try and track down some information with the voting equipment, because we do want to make sure that private and independent option is available.
There was talk about this soft rollout for the voter ID back in the summer. What kinds of things were exposed during that time that we might anticipate, and what is being done to help alleviate some of the challenges that people have?
Well, during the past year, so when was Act 23, the photo ID law was passed about June of 2011. Since then, for elections until February 2012, any elections that occur, we are going through what we call soft implementation, where people are asked to show their photo identification, but it's not required still starting in 2012. But other things were required, like signing of the poll list, and we found that it did take a longer time on election day for people to get through the lines and to get to vote their ballot. There are clerks who are working on coming up with ideas about adding more poll workers, rearranging the way that their polling place is set up. But ultimately, people are going to have to be aware, and part of our education is that it's going to take a little bit longer on election day, and that people should come on election day prepared. Have your photo identification with you. Have it out when you are getting up to the table to announce your name and show your ID and sign the poll list. And know that you're going to have to sign the poll list. And that is going to take an amount of time for poll workers to see an ID, review it for name, photo expiration, and then have a person sign is going to take a little extra time, even with extra staffing at the polling places.
Was there much of an issue with people not identifying or looking like their picture?
I haven't heard any
No.
stories of that myself. The main thing that we saw with the soft implementation, or the main obstacle I think we saw with the soft implementation, were individuals who were either unaware or they were aware and were intentionally not providing their identification or signing the poll book as a form of protest. I don't know how much of that will continue to occur in 2012, but come 2012, come that February election in 2012, it will be required, and the only option at that point will be to vote a provisional ballot.
And you cannot use your Colorado gun license as an ID. That was something we learned. Someone showed their Colorado gun license for their photo ID. So
Yeah.
you cannot use that. But that is, we just, learned a couple of things. And military, veteran affairs IDs, that's kind of where that came up, where people were asking if they could use that, and out-of-state IDs. So that's kind of where we came back with some feedback for IDs that people were trying to use that are not acceptable IDs. So out-of-state IDs or the IDs issued by military affairs are not acceptable forms of photo ID.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions?
Could you comment on the decision by the Joint Committee on Rules today on the 3 issues about voting, the colleges, the...
Stickers.
Stickers and recouples.
Yeah.
Not to be flip, but no.
Yeah.
We're not authorized to comment on those sorts of things.
It's out of our pay range. Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you for having us. I think we're going to give
We'll give
Kay,
Kay the last word.
Thank you very much, David and Katie. Really appreciated your clear explanations of things. I attended one much earlier in this season of educational opportunities, and I thought, well, this is some different stuff. So thank you for continually updating